Thanks everybody for coming in. So this week is officially week 4, starts today, but it's all of next week, and of the MGT 6151 course. And today we're going to we're going to kind of extend our discussion from value delivery strategy and integration into the project selection and initiation part of the project management. Project selection and initiation are kind of similar for all of the different approaches. Um, we'll move in next week into planning, and that'll be more focused on the predictive model. But I'll try to explain that the best I can how that works here. So, sort of before a project is planned or executed, there's a lot of decisions that get made. Should we do the work at all? And if we do, are we ready to commit our resources to it? So this is project selection determines where organizations are going to invest their limited resources. And then initiation formalizes that decision into a commitment and gives authority and direction to the project manager and the team and other stakeholders to make this transition from strategic intent to authorized, action to take. So project selection determines where organizations invest limited resources. And so we have to, before we get into initiating and planning, we have to talk about how we're going to select these projects. Most organizations almost always have more good ideas than they have time or money or people to implement those ideas. So this is where leadership in project selection decides what we're going to invest in. And so this matters because a project can be delivered perfectly, we've mentioned this before, on time, on budget, and all within all the constraints, and still fail to deliver value because maybe it wasn't really aligned with organizational strategy and shouldn't have been selected in the first place. So that's what's important about these decisions to shape strategic alignment, shape risk exposure, and then ultimately value realization in the marketplace or to the organization. So that's why we need to understand project selection, even if we don't personally make these portfolio decisions. I know in a lot of my experience, I'm kind of have been just assigned to a project that's already underway or already selected. And my role as a project manager back in those days was just to kind of go through the initiation process and get the project underway. But it helps to understand this decision process and what goes into it for that initiation process. So project selections, it's not approval to start work. Again, it's a commitment decision. So before we initiate a project, we need to make this decision. And it's essentially, as I've said, it's where we decide if an idea deserves our commitment from the organization. So it doesn't mean let's explore. We probably should have already done that. It means authorizing the work, authorizing funding. And so if we don't do a good job of selecting the projects, then what we do in initiation is just formalize what could be a bad decision. So we need to be aware of that. Organizations tend to evaluate projects based on comparative value. So that means they're comparing one thing to another, and none of these criteria exist in isolation. So like strategic alignment, expected value, risk, resource compliance. Selecting a project that we're going to do is rarely just a simple yes or no. It's a comparison exercise. So we need to weigh one opportunity against the other. And usually it's under some sort of uncertainty and political pressures. So what matters for project managers is an understanding why it was selected, because that context shapes expectations from stakeholders. It has the understanding the tolerance, the risk appetite that our stakeholders have, and then how the organization or our beneficiaries, those that we're doing this for, are going to be judged, how they're going to judge our success later, how we're going to measure success. So it's not about, just checking off boxes. It's about deciding which bets, if you will, uh, the organization's willing to take. So which ones are those the best ones to take? So it's a structured process, a structured decision process, not a single approval moment. It might be that there's a official gate. Like when I was did some work with Sony Pictures a few years ago, they would get together and they would green light projects. The whole entertainment way of approving things is interesting, but they had a formal meeting where the projects that got pushed into initiation were greenlit for that, was the terminology they used. So project selection unfolds through a series of decisions, and so ideas are surfaced and they're screened for alignment. They're evaluated for value and risk. Then they're compared, that comparative analysis I talked about earlier. And then only a subset of all the available initiatives sort of earn the right, if you will, to move forward into initiation. So again, we're not authorizing the project's execution yet, but it's authorizing that further commitment in analysis. And so it begins with identifying candidate ideas. So it's referred to as ideation often, and it's about generating and capturing ideas without committing to them. So ideas can come from pretty much anywhere, but they come from our strategy, they come from operations. Maybe we've got some innovation that we're trying to do and innovate a new product or something like that, or we have compliance needs. So at this stage in the game, it's not approval, it's visibility. It's about selecting which area to select. And so it depends on making sure that we have a clear view of all the different options that we have. So this at this stage, this is pretty much a sort of a portfolio responsibility area. There's usually a funnel that you'll hear this when you get into organizations that do lots of projects. They'll have a funnel that goes into, say, the PMO, the project management office, or the program management office, or the portfolio. The same acronym works for all of them, and they do this comparison analysis and decide which ones that they're going to undertake. And so only ideas that align with organizational strategy should move forward. So after we have ideation, we can, kind of look and see how these ideas that we came up with we screen these for strategic fit. And so this is kind of an early filter, and we're not, we're just kind of looking for alignment here. And if the current project or initiative doesn't support our strategic priorities, we shouldn't do anything else to further consume any resources on it. I mean, even if it's something that's technically feasible or it's interesting, if it doesn't align with organizational goals, it probably shouldn't be done unless it's mandatory. And mandatory could come from, a lot will come from regulatory or operations type things, but even the operations things should be in the strategy. Mandatory. Matter of fact, I was just listening this morning to a newscast about Valero pulling out of California. They were kind of given some mandatory regulatory requirements, and they decided even then it wasn't feasible. So they decided to close the refinery there. I think it's in San Francisco area in April. So their project now is to shut that refinery down. So financial and feasibility metrics support the project selection by helping us enabling informed comparison. So at this stage of project selection, we're really often applying high level analysis, financial analysis, usually to compare these initiatives. So the goal is not precision forecasting, but it's relative comparison, understanding which projects are more likely to deliver economic value under certain uncertainty. And so we've got there's like 4 major or 5 major ways that we've done this in the past and still continue to do, but there's a concept of net present value. And net present value estimates the net economic benefit of a project by considering the time value of money. So the idea is a dollar uh, today is going to be worth more in the future. And so what we do is we look into the future and think about, well, what is this project? What are the financial benefits, economic benefits of this project? And do apply a net present value formula that it's called discounting it back to today's all to dollars. So we can look at all these things and calculate net present value on them and compare them in more current um, value. So it's the greater the expected value or the greater the net present value, uh, the more likely the project is feasible or doable economically, but it depends on assumptions about future benefits and costs, which is the kind of one of the problems with doing this. You're asking people to forecast. The internal rate of return, this emphasizes the expected return of a project as a percentage. And it's useful for comparing projects of different sizes. But it can be misleading when we have projects that are longer or shorter or have more risk. Again, you have to consider all of those items. Payback period looks at how quickly an investment recovers the initial cost. And organizations tend to use this as a proxy for risk. The shorter payback period can feel safer. In other words, we're going to get our money back quicker, but it may ignore long-term benefits beyond the break-even point. So we have to kind of use all three of these together to come up with a good picture of how the economics of the projects are going to work, especially the future economics. The cost benefit comparison is where we do a cost benefit analysis that compares these expected benefits to total cost. And we can include financial and even operational cost, strategic benefits. And this is a simple concept, but it depends on what benefits we're talking about. It depends on how and when they're going to be valued. So there's uncertainty involved with all of these. And so none of these tools should be used to make the decision by themselves, but they help the decision makers compare their options, helps them to surface trade-offs, and helps to ask better questions. So these financial analyses are used to inform judgment, not to replace it. So once we've evaluated these initiatives individually, we need to kind of step back and decide which combination of projects makes the most sense for our portfolio or for our organization. And so project selection requires prioritizing initiatives across the different competing constraints of limited capacity. So after we've evaluated the projects, we need to compare them sort of side by side. And this is where we prioritize the projects. So we need to consider the relative value, the risk exposure, the resource demands across all of the candidate initiatives. We don't want to do this in isolation. We want to look at them as a whole. And so this is where we really start looking at trade-offs. They really become unavoidable at this point. So a high value project might be delayed because resources committed elsewhere, or a lower return project may move forward because it supports some critical strategic or objective or regulatory requirement. So again, this is primarily a portfolio decision, but it's about deciding how we're going to invest our limited time, money, and attention to achieve the overall greatest value. So on the screen here, they've got high, medium, low priority projects, and they've kind of high value ones. There's medium risk. Uh, you have to look at the trade-offs. It depends on your organization's appetite for taking on risk. It depends on your resource capability. So this slide's just kind of give you an impression of how that might look. A lot of places have dashboards that they can do this one, or they do spreadsheets and things like have accountants, economists put this together for them, or the project portfolio managers themselves. Um, Not all projects are selected for competitive value. Some are required. I've talked about these mandatory, they're required to sort of protect the organization. So we've talked about prioritizing projects based on value, risk, and feasibility, but you know, uh, not all projects enter the selection process on sort of equal footing. Mandatory and compliance projects are there because the organization must do them for some reason. Regulatory requirements, things like safety obligations, critical system replacements may leave us no real choice. So the decision is not whether you do the project, but how and when. And in this same thing I was looking at this morning, they were talking about um, a new law that was passed last year in California that's going to require I think it's all educational institutions to have a gender neutral restroom facility. So that's a mandatory project. They were talking about the cost and what it's going to take for all the people to comply with that. And they've got I think the timeline on it's pretty quick. I think it's like they got 18 months or something like that to comply. And then if they don't comply, there's lots of negative consequences. So that's an example of a mandatory project. All these institutions are going to have to do that. So, but all that said, these organizations still compete for limited resources, right? They affect our capacity to do other things. They delay discretionary initiatives. They influence the balance of the portfolio. And even, you know, when the value is what we would call defensive value, in other words, or avoiding fines, avoiding lawsuits, avoiding production outages, it's still a value that we have. It's a sort of a defensive value. So uh, strong organizations recognize mandatory projects so they don't distort prioritization decisions or crowd out strategic initiatives. So they leave room in their portfolio for mandatory things. So once the mandatory commitments are accounted for and discretionary initiatives are prioritized, they can decide which projects need to move on. So they get the old move into initiation. And there's another concept that I haven't talked about in here yet, but it's a concept of opportunity cost. One of the things that we're doing when we're using these economic values, we need to look at the opportunity of, well, if we select this project, what's the opportunity of not selecting that project? And so that's part of the trade-offs that we're making in this process. So again, only authorized initiatives should be approved to enter project initiation. And so the final step is in selection at this point is to move into initiation. So the only initiatives that survive this prioritization should including, consideration of mandatory projects and resource constraints should move forward. So at this point, ideally, a sponsor is, if not already identified, should be identified. And the sponsor can be an individual, like in the agile world, we call it an epic owner. It could be a portfolio owner, some or product manager. It could be a committee, like a steering committee. Those are common for regulatory, mandatory type things. And so we need to make sure we have that authority uh, clarified and identified, and then at this point the organization has agreed to invest time and further effort in validating the project further. So they're not saying we're going to do it. They're just saying that we've greenlit this, to use the Sony terminology, to move to the next phase, which is initiating. So it doesn't mean that we're going to go and fully plan it or that we're guaranteed to proceed. There's assumptions that are made. We need to look at the scope. It could be that during the project somewhere we find that the environment's changed and it's no longer strategically aligned or it's no longer financially feasible. And a lot of times that comes out during the initiation process. And so initiation occurs when there's uncertainty has been reduced enough to justify commitment. So this is on the slide here is an image of a representation of what we call the cone of uncertainty. And basically what it says is that things that exist out here in the idea realm are highly uncertain. And as we move into this evaluation and prioritization thing, we select more. And so we're still, we try to drive this down. We don't really know what the outcome is going to be until till the project's finished, really. There's uncertainty that goes all the way through the project. But we get to a point where we're sort of comfortable with the level of uncertainty, and that's when we want to start doing uh, project initiatives. So we've got reduced uncertainty. We've got some leadership's confident this is strategically aligned, and so we've had the formal authority established, and accountability for it has been assigned. So if you know, we've already evaluated the project, so the question is, why do we need initiation? Well, that's because we still have this uncertainty. So the cone of uncertainty explains why it doesn't happen, why project initiation doesn't just happen at the first good idea. And so it'd be a huge waste of resources to do that. So early concepts are usually uncertain about pretty much everything: scope, cost, risk, benefits. And it's through the selection that we progressively reduce that uncertainty. And so the initiation should occur at a point where we're confident enough that to formally commit our resources and authority, um, even though we still have some uncertainty. We're never going to remove the uncertainty completely until we essentially close out the project. And so this is why the project initiation process, or it's called focus group now, focus area. The PMBOK 7, prior to PMBOK 8, they called the process groups. They call them process groups. So there's initiating, planning, execution, monitoring, control. Those are all work process groups. Now with the publication of PMBOK 8, those are called focus areas. So initiation focus area is where project integration is, and initiation is part of the project integration focus area. And so that's to represent this boundary where decisions kind of cut across governance, stakeholders, value expectations, and move into to initiation. And so it's part of that integration. Part of integration is initiating a project, planning the project, creating a project plan, and doing the project work, monitoring, controlling. It kind of covers the whole life cycle. So project initiation aligns purpose, authority, and stakeholders before work really starts to begin. But in reality, what happens is a lot of work gets done during the selection process. A lot of times there's prototypes that are generated. There's in the adaptive world, they have this minimal viable product concept where you generate a hypothesis and test the hypothesis for your initiative, and there's work that goes into that testing. And so a lot of times you've got some work that's done, and we don't want to, discount that work. We want to bring it forward into the initiation process. So, but work hasn't like officially began on the project until we get through initiation. So according to PMI, this initiating focus area includes all the actions taken to define a new project or a new phase. If you've got a really big project that has phases, it's not unusual to have initiating phase at each one. And I would say that even in an agile project, you kind of have every iteration or every sprint has a little bit of initiation piece to it. It's sliced into smaller pieces. We'll see a little bit of what that looks like in a couple slides. But eh, the the idea is that we want alignment with stakeholders' expectations. We want to align those with the purpose, scope, and objectives of the project. So at this point, we identify key stakeholders and their roles are clarified. We understand sort of the initial financial and scope commitments that are made. And we emphasize that projects should be authorized when they only when they align with strategic objectives and when the business case considerations and benefits are addressed from the start. This is why with initiation, it's kind of in that integration management I talked about. It considers makes considerations of benefits and it connects those with the governance and stakeholders. So it may involve different roles depending on the organization. Sometimes the project manager is involved early. In other cases, it's the sponsor, the PMO, or the portfolio governance group that leads the work, as I've kind of mentioned before. It depends on how your organization has implemented their project management approach. If you've got the adaptive world calls them center of excellence. They're also creating something called value management offices, VMOs. And in the more predictive world, they've got program management offices. They've got portfolio management offices. So we have individuals in those groups that may be involved early, and then it's handed off to a project manager. A lot of times, a project manager, or even in an agile world, it'd be more like a product manager, maybe, would report up into these organizations, and you can volunteer for projects or you're assigned projects at this point. So this image is a kind of shows where project initiation falls in the sort of the predictive approach. You can see all these little arcs here are different phases and they overlap each other. There's a tendency to think, well, this is all just waterfall. We do one thing after another. We move on. And, I mentioned sometimes it's a lot of work that gets done as we're going through these things. So we have this initiation, it kind of goes up and comes down, but you can see we start planning. We even maybe even start executing the project a little bit. We might have developed some value that we can deliver. Like we've got maybe a prototype out there or say a working model that we can go ahead and deploy and get some feedback on. And but typically in a predictive type model, we start here with initiation, and these things all kind of start ramping up, and then we get into planning in a big way, and you can see everything kind of goes up and forms these curves like this. And then somewhere in here we start this closing area. This is where we start to accept deliverables and start closing the project out. So we don't always wait till the end of the project to deliver the value. It can be done over time. So this image is from PMBOK 8, and it's the same image that I've seen in other versions of the PMBOK. It's just kind of modified a little bit to show the different roles here that are going. This is the PMBOK 8's version of how this works in a adaptive approach. And they show these little peaks and valleys of planning and these peaks and valleys of executing. And then they still have this monitoring controlling function that goes over here. We have the initiating piece here. In my experience, I would say this little initiating piece, while in the beginning it's going to be a little larger, but then at every one of these little, when we start up a new sprint, we have a little bit of initiating that goes here that they don't show on here. And then this closing piece of it in an adaptive world, this would be like closing / continue, the way I would do it. And the model that I generated has that. So what you do, it depends on what you're doing. If you're working on an app, then you might close that out. But you might have features you're wanting to add in later. So that would be a continue type model. You wouldn't just close it out completely, and you would want to continue it. So there's a decision that has to be made in the adaptive world. Have we done enough? Do we want to close this project, or do we want to continue? And that's really a decision. That's one of these, it's kind of a selection decision that gets made with the team, the stakeholders, the Epic owner, the project owner, and that sort of thing that gets made. And if we decide to continue, then we just kind of repeat this process over and over. So this is a table that comes from the PMBOK guide, and it's essentially they've had this table like this for a while, but this one's updated for PMBOK 8, and it shows one thing it shows is that initiating projects is not done in just one domain. We've got sort of the stakeholder domain here and governance domains, and we have this initiating focus area here. So there's a formal initiating focus area, but there's already multiple performance domains might already be active. We might already be in looking at some, we might be have some scope definition that comes out of um, the selection process, as we have evaluated what the project's going to do. There may be some timeline things, and we'll have initial look at resources. So all these things in initiation are already kind of in some state of progress, and we're not really when we're in the initiating process uh, group or process initiating process when we're creating a project charter, for example. What we're trying to do is bring all that work that we've done already in the selection and the ideation, from ideation through selection. We're trying to bring all that into focus in the project charter, and then that gets moved into planning. And that's why they're not really showing up here, is that it's the sort of the this is really kind of identifying some of that and formalizing uh, where we are in the project. So, from a government's perspective, the project authorizes the project or phase. So that's what we're doing in the initiation group. That's what the project charter does for us. And from the stakeholder perspective, we begin identifying who matters and who has influence and who's going to be accountable. So, at this point, the scope in finance, as I mentioned, we're intentionally leaving all this stuff at very high level. We're not planning in detail yet. We're looking at purpose. We're looking at boundaries. We're looking at commitment of initial resources. So that's why we uh, initiation, the specially developed project charter process and the identify stakeholders process uh, kind of exists outside of the other focus areas. The one thing I will say though about we'll get into looking at identify stakeholders, stakeholder identification. And there's a couple, three or four of these um, performance domains that we kind of tend to need to do uh, throughout the project. And stakeholder identification is one of them. The other one is risk, and the other one would be schedule, the triple constraints, scope, schedule, quality. But we needed to have periodic stakeholder identification sort of activity because stakeholders changed. We have people that are involved early in the project that may when their role is done, they move on to other stuff. We have people that come into the project at different phases, and even with adaptive projects, the team the idea there's an idea that's kind of permeating project management, and it's one that sort of came out of the Agile Manifesto, and that is long-lived teams, that we want to keep teams together. And even in that environment, we have other stakeholders that come and go. So we want to make sure we understand those. We want to make sure we understand their needs and how to keep them engaged with what's going on. And I think I've mentioned this, well, I know I've mentioned this in other lectures, is that one of the big problems with the way we did work prior to the publication of the Agile Manifesto is that um, we didn't engage stakeholders into the process effectively. And so when we made our deliverables, whether they were delivered incrementally or not, oftentimes the stakeholders were disappointed in what we delivered. And so we made a lot of progress in that area. And one of those is sort of the consistent identification of stakeholders, what their roles are. And I'll talk about that some more. But the project initiation formalizes the intent through a small set of foundational artifacts, essentially two. Maybe there's three. There's one called an assumption log. But once we decide that we're going to pursue the work, we want to start working on the project charter. And the project charter is the most important initiation artifact. It's in my experience, it's been one of the most important artifacts that we have because it documents that we actually did this initiating activity. And what happens some of my career I've spent doing what's called project rescue. And you get in, and what that means is that the project is so far off its initial expectations that the organization has decided that they need to either, you know, take some drastic measure to turn it around or to discontinue it. So they bring in somebody like me, third party usually that can make a more objective view of what's going on. Because once the team and the organization's sort of committed to it, it's sometimes it's difficult to detach. So they bring in consultants usually to do this work. And one of the things I'd always ask for is, well, where is your project initiation documented? And a lot of times they've just moved right out of the selection right into doing project work, and they never really sit down and define and get authorization and do all this stuff. And so you wind up having to basically replan the project, go back through this initiating process, and then they have to make a decision: do we continue or not? And usually that means that you have to go back and re-baseline all of your baselines or redo all your planning. And so without that project charter as sort of the beacon of where we want to go, you can lose track. If you don't have if a ship doesn't have a view of the horizon, then it's easy to get off course. And that's one of the benefits of the project charter is that it's that sort of map of where we're going to go, high level. The next one here is a stakeholder register. This is a way to ensure or understand who matters. And at this point, we're kind of looking at early stakeholders, before we make any decisions in isolation. So at this point, we don't have any schedules. We don't have any real budgets. We have maybe some high-level estimates. We don't have a work breakdown structure. Initiation creates alignment and authority, and we're not into execution or into planning. And we'll cover those later in the course. So the create project charter process is this is where we frame let me back up. The PMI uses this input, tools, and techniques output model. And it was something that in PMBOK 7, we kind of got away from. They brought it back in PMBOK 8, but they also documented it in the process groups practice guide in that other document that I asked you all to download. So all this kind of input, tools, and techniques. The one thing they did that's kind of frustrating is they used to keep them all together in and now what happens is you go look at the project charter process and it says inputs and outputs. Then the tools and techniques, it'll list them. But if you want detail on the tools and techniques, you have to go to a separate section. And I think they did that just to eliminate, duplication, which is great. But the inputs in this model represent why the project exists, in this case for the create project charter process. And so the business needs, the benefits, the constraints, the organizational context, and the tools and techniques are how we're going to interpret and align that intent. So we've got expert judgment. This is relying on, subject matter experts or people that have domain knowledge in what the project's doing. Usually it's stakeholders that went through that selection process. And then there's data gathering, which is a part of what we're doing, go around and interview team members and talk to them about what's going on. And then facilitation through interpersonal skills. And then there's a tool on here that's mentioned. It's called a Canvas. We used to just call these spreadsheets or, but they are artifacts. They've kind of got these idea that, and this canvassing come out of a design thinking kind of concept. Design thinking is sort of a new way it's an innovation tool, but they have these things called canvases, and they're just graphical representations where you can list things and you can see it all kind of in a holistic view. And they have a project initiating canvas. They have a project vision canvas and things like that. Uh, so the inputs establish the rationale for the project. So business case and benefits plan explain why the project should exist. So it gives us the benefit plan gives us target benefits in the strategic alignment, the time frame for benefits realization, who the benefit owner is, any kind of metrics we might have, assumptions, and risk and things we learned from the um, selection process. And then uh, they list here enterprise and uh, organizational assets. These are organizational and environmental factors that shape our constraints and our expectations. So enterprise environment, we mentioned these external environments. The uh, enterprise environment is the environment, sort of the external environment, and maybe into the corporate culture and how that impacts the project. And then organizational process assets are these are artifacts from usually from just operation of the organization. So it could be that we've done a similar project in the past and we have their artifacts archived someplace that we can go and help us maybe identify risk early, identify schedule problems, things like that. So these are also things like that affect our project, like procurement requirements, quality requirements, regulatory, how the organization has implemented regulatory requirements. All those things need to come in here uh, into this. A lot of times, these just kind of exist in databases or in the sort of the implicit knowledge that people have from working in the domain or with the organization. Tools and techniques here, I've talked about those. And then the outputs, the project charter itself, this grants authority to do the project and defines the purpose and the boundaries of the project, sort of the official looking at it. And then there's something called an assumption log. And one of the things we want to do in these logs, there's a couple of logs that we'll keep in as project managers. And one is an issues log and another one is an assumption log. And so we begin with the assumption log. And this is where we want to capture any of uncertainties that we've identified through this process. We don't really need to do deep dive into these assumptions at this point. This is something we'll probably bring over further into planning, but we want to capture them in this log so we don't lose track of it. I've seen teams have assumption boards, where they work close to where the team is working, or they have something like a Trello board or some kind of online tool where they can post-it notes and things like that, which is it's a little more collaborative than just having a log that's text-based. But in either case, you want to have some mechanism for capturing these assumptions that we're making along the way. The project charter formally authorizes the work and empowers the leadership. So it's not a planning document. Its role is to answer why the project exists, what authority exists, and who's going to be accountable. So the purpose and objectives clarify what the project is, why it's being undertaken, and what success looks like at a high level. And they should align directly with the strategy and expected benefits. And they're not detailed deliverables at this point. And the next thing is high-level scope. This is, again, intentionally broad. It defines boundaries, what's included, what's excluded, without getting into schedules and work packages. All that detail comes later during planning. The business value, again, this is sort of a critical emphasis, but the charter should clearly state how the project delivers value, the financial, operational, strategic, or social value. If we can't articulate here, then maybe we shouldn't proceed with the project. So if we can't really get a clear understanding what the value is, maybe we shouldn't proceed. Then one of the main things it does here is it formally authorizes the project manager to expend resources on the project. So it empowers the project manager to apply organizational resources, make decision within certain defined limits, and lead the effort. So this is where the first accountability for the project manager goes. So we want to make sure we have clear accountability for the project manager. And this is going to be influenced by your organizational culture. There's several different types of environments. You may have a what's called a projectized environment where everything's done through projects in the organization, or you may have sort of a functional environment, which is the typical hierarchical view. That's going to affect how much authority the project manager has and how accountability is spread across the organization. So this accountability has to be considered in the context. You may have some kind of um, cross-functional organization where you have the team, say maybe they report to project manager for day-to-day stuff, but they also have a sort of a domain manager, kind of like the software development. A lot of times they'll have a what do they call them now? I can't think of the name of it. But anyway, they'll have one that just the software development manager who manages the technical authority and make sure that they have, the training they need, the tools they need, and all of that. So they have a dual matrix type of structure. And then we have the sponsor and establish governance oversight. So this basically defines who owns the business case, who approves changes, and how we escalate decisions through this. So strong governance at initiation prevents confusion later. And so the takeaway here is that the project charter sets our direction, sets our authority. It's not detail. It creates a shared understanding and permission to proceed. And we further extend this into planning. So the charter development is a shared responsibility. It's not the question all comes up, who does it? And sort of the traditional thinking is that this is the job of the project manager to do. It's like the first job you do. That's sort of changed. And matter of fact, I don't think I've maybe only done 3 or 4 projects where I had the responsibility for doing this. I usually lead the process, but it's a collaborative thing, generally. So the project sponsor owns the business need and provides the funding authority. So this is the person that ultimately authorizes, the person or group, I should say, that authorizes and signs the project charter. This ensures that we have their accountability here is to alignment and the benefits of the project. And then the project manager, if we're assigned early, sometimes these project charters are developed, like I mentioned, within a center of excellence or a PMO, and then they assign a project manager sort of as part of this process. But they may help draft or refine this. It's usually a collaborative process where the project manager is one of those subject matter experts that can provide perspective, help understand assumptions along with the risk of executing projects, and helps to clarify authority, constraints, and success criteria. And then the portfolio or the program or the PMO or steering committee, depends on how your organization is set up, as I mentioned, may develop the charter in sort of a program portfolio environment. And what this does is helps to ensure that we have consistency with organizational standards and prioritization decisions that are made within the organization. And then we have stakeholders identified here in the high-level stakeholders that provide input on the objectives, the boundaries, the risk, and constraints. So the project manager doesn't grant authority here. The charter grants authority to the project manager, and the authority comes from the sponsor and or the organization in how it's set up. So let's see if I can bring this up. This is a project charter for a project that I did, or I wasn't the only one on it. There was a bunch of us that worked on it. And there's no rule of thumb on how extensive these project charters have to be. My advice has always been they need to be as simple as possible. If you kind of can, at least I can remember back when they would say, well, you don't have a 1-page resume. Well, I don't think I've seen a resume lately that's one page, because people nowadays have a lot more opportunities to get experience than we used to. And it's kind of the same thing with the charter. I've seen several of these that are multiple pages. The problem is you start, the more sort of extensive project charter artifact is, the more it kind of bleeds into the planning. And I think there sort of needs to be a clear boundary. But having said that, this is one that we did. It was for a large telecommunications company back in, this would have been in around 2000 when the dot com thing was in full bloom. And actually, it was for Ameritech, which was the company in the Midwest, Chicago area, Illinois, and Great Lakes sort of area. And fiber optics was kind of being the big thing. DSL circuits, sort of old technology, was really growing. Internet bandwidth was really growing at this time. And so you can see one of the things that we haven't talked about as part of the project charters comes from the business case. And that's this first statement here is the vision statement for the project. And it says here that, sorry about that. It says here that the project is a 3-year, and it was $3 billion basically initiative to transform the network into the nation's premier platform for delivering broadband services to meet the current and future needs of our customers. So the objective is to make broadband services featuring a minimum upstream and downstream connection of 1.5 megabits, which is very slow by today's terminology, but available to 80% of our customers by January 15th, 2002. So there's their strategic alignment with this. It says here the stakes are high. It's a race to market. So they're kind of talking here about the risk of not doing this. It says here they're going to push the fiber deeper into the neighborhoods we serve, and we're going to create a core network to handle the resulting data traffic much more efficiently. So now they're talking about some of the benefits of this. And then they're saying that this is the financial allocation. They've been allocated $2.9 billion to implement the project by 2002, and dedicated construction force and headcount have been provided. So again, they're talking about the resources here. This is sort of the resource allocation part of this. And the project is the number one priority for the network services. So now they're saying, okay, this is our number one priority for network services. And now they're getting in here some of the high level deliverables. They got a commitment of passing 8 million households will be achieved by the following deliverables. And so they're listing these high level. They're not getting into detail. They're talking about turning up light spans and upgrading software and placing service area interfaces and rolling the circuits over and constructing fiber backbones and things like that. And the team is responsible for successful implementation of all aspects of the build, and the entire network services organization has the responsibility to make available resources for this initiative. So then they're laying out this. And so they're listing the project management team here, and I put cartoon characters in here because I don't want to list their official names, but the PM, the project manager, the project coordinator, and then the engineering construction team and the regional network engineering team. And then down here, it's signed by the different people in the organization, and it's signed by the president and CEO of network services. It's signed by the vice president of network services. It's signed by the engineering construction people. It's signed by the network planning and strategy and the vice president of network engineering. So this is kind of what I would consider a really tight project charter. You may have in your particular situation, you may have an environment that they may have a template or something that's more than this, but at a minimum, it should have this. The reason we kept this really short is because we had all of these people on here, these teams, this group down in here. This represented about maybe probably close to 1,200 people. And we didn't want to get into a really detailed document that would lead to confusion. We wanted to keep the strategic alignment clear. We wanted to keep the budget for this clear. We wanted to keep the high level objectives clear. And we wanted to keep the accountability for the project clear. And so that's why we made a really strong effort to getting it down to this language. And it took a lot of iterations to get it here, but that's where we eventually got it there. So once a project's authorized, one of the first actions is identifying stakeholders. And so the PMI reminds us that stakeholders are not just people that we communicate with, but they're people who can influence our decisions and shape project outcomes or impact our success. And so at this stage, we're not building detailed stakeholder engagement plans. We're sort of establishing awareness of the stakeholder in terms of who cares and who can help it succeed and who could stop it and who could be a detriment. And so early identification is part of our initiating process, a focus area, helps to reduce surprises later, like resistance, conflict in scope, misaligned expectation. And so this is why stakeholder identification belongs in initiating, but it's also a reason we want to carry it forward throughout all phases of the project. And so this is identify stakeholders process. And this shows the tools, the inputs, tools, and techniques of this process. And you notice that it lives again. I talked about initiating. That means the stakeholder begins before we do any detailed planning. And so the most important output here is the stakeholder register. And it's not a full-blown communications plan, but it becomes an input to the communication plan. And the stakeholder register is a visibility tool. It answers those questions and sort of further refine the questions down as to who can influence the project, who's affected by it, who could support or who could resist it. And one of the things that happens with stakeholder identification, it can trigger change requests as we get more feedback and more information. It can change updates to plans. It can, because discovering stakeholders reveals new risk, frequently new constraints and new expectations. And so one of the things is that projects a lot of time will fail to succeed because they've misidentified or they they've missed stakeholders that can impact the project. So it's not a one-time checklist. It's a repeating awareness activity that involves environment changes. The stakeholder register creates visibility and awareness, and it's often kind of one of these misunderstood tools, artifacts that we have. And some people think it's just sort of an administrative thing, but it exists to create visibility and awareness of our project. Visibility is one of the main things, keeping it on the minds of stakeholders. And so we're capturing what we know so far. And we've probably learned a lot during this, or the folks that were doing the selection. That's why it's important that we document what we're doing in selection well, and that should be part of your project environment. So that those artifacts, that stuff that we learned in selection becomes those organizational process assets that we bring into here. But the stakeholder register is going to change as stakeholders join, leave, and they gain influence or lose interest. That's why we want to do this kind of as a iterative thing. So the key point, if we have a stakeholder that's missing from this register, they may be invisible and they could generate surprises. And this is sort of an example. Stakeholders, I guess it's really good time to identify what a stakeholder is. And this was my modification of sort of the definition that you see in a lot of the project management text. But it's any individual, group, or organization that may affect or be affected by or perceive itself to be affected by a project, its execution, and or its outcomes. Should have had and or in there. So in other words, it's anybody that thinks they can be impacted by the project, whether it's a real or perceived. My experience, one a good example that I've come across with this, at least I think it's a good example, is way back. I forget how long ago it was. It's got to be, but there was the Exxon Valdez oil spill that happened up in Alaska, where the Exxon Valdez ship, I guess, went aground and leaked a bunch of oil all over the coastline and really had a huge negative environmental impact. And it was on the news. And I lived in the Dallas area at the time and was working over in Irving, Texas area, which is a suburb if you're not familiar. And that's where the Exxon headquarters were. I think they still are there. But you drive by there, I drive by there on my way to the office every day, and there'd be people out in front protesting, carrying signs, and, and these people were not directly impacted by this. It was more local to the people of Alaska and the marine life and, you know, the economy, the ecology there in Alaska, and of course to um, Exxon. But people felt that they have an interest in the environment in general, so they have a perceived interest in this one incident and the cleanup, and so that's where this perceived impact comes from. So you may have people that in your organization that are not involved at all in your project, but because they're a stakeholder of the organization, they perceive themselves as a stakeholder in your project. And they are, but it's not often a clear line that you can uh, spot. So this they call these diagrams here, they call these onion diagrams, and you'll see these a lot in the project management area, and they're used to kind of communicate when there's layers to things. So when we get into planning, there'll be a planning onion that we'll look at. But in this case, it shows that down here, your kind of stakeholders tend to be organized in these layers. I used to represent this as sort of a target, and that the project team is in the center, and you would go out from the target like a dartboard. Uh, this kind of shows the same thing, but I think it implies a level of importance that may not exist. But anyway, the project manager and the project team and is the core stakeholders. Then we have the project sponsor or the sponsoring organization, and then portfolio group, program management, program office, functional management. Then we have customers, and then we have regulatory agencies. And the idea is that this onion is kind of structured in their relative ability to influence what's going on in the project. So people closest to the project tend to have the most direct control or influence over what's going on, and those outside tend to have less daily interaction and less influence. But they can still stop a project through some kind of, regulation, accepting the deliverables, or some kind of public pressure. I mean, uh, sort of the modern way of this onion has customers out here. The more modern approach would have customers maybe right down in here somewhere, um, you know. But the idea is that you could have customers, you could take some to the market, and they could just not adopt it. In that, then, but if you fail to identify who your main beneficiary is, that could be a, a detriment to the project success. You can have regulatory agencies up here that all of a sudden they make a regulation, like the California thing. They make a regulation now. All of a sudden, these or these universities or these educational institutions, it's not just universities, but educational institutions in general, have to do all this construction. All of a sudden, that's going to gobble up resources from existing projects. So that regulatory thing impacts stuff. So that's one way to look at how this power and influence, and which is one of the things that we want to identify as part of our stakeholder register. Another common mistakes in projects is assuming that external stakeholders our internal stakeholders matter more than external stakeholders. So stakeholders uh, influence projects in different ways, and not one is any more important than the other one, but they may have to be treated with different priority, but they're still stakeholders, and they often control acceptance or compliance or just feasibility of the project. So a regulator may have no internal authority but can stop a project externally, which I've talked about. And this distinction between stakeholders matters because they're your engagement strategy for a different stakeholder, a type of stakeholder is going to differ. So you don't manage your project sponsor the same way you would manage a customer or a vendor in that respect. So identifying whether a stakeholder is external or internal in their role helps us to uh, anticipate how their influence on the project is going to be exercised and how important they are to our project. Stakeholders require different engagement strategies based on influence and interest. And this is a picture of the um, stakeholder influence interest matrix that you can use when you're trying to figure out what stakeholders are. So once we've identified the stakeholders, sort of the next step is to figure out how we're going to engage the stakeholders. And so this matrix helps us to avoid a couple of common mistakes in understanding their influence. And that's one, over communicating with everyone, and two, ignoring people who later can become powerful influencers or even blockers of the project. So influence refers to a stakeholder's ability to affect decisions and outcomes, and interest refers to how much they care about a project's results. And engagement strategies should match those dimensions. And so, and stakeholders kind of move around in the project environment as it's underway. And so a low power or low influence stakeholder today may gain more influence tomorrow, and especially during some kind of sort of a change or implementation that happens in the project. And so during ex during project execution, we establish engagement baseline. I mean, engage stakeholders based on expectations and outcomes. So it's about early awareness and alignment, and not about detailed communication at this point. We'll be developing communications plan as part of our planning. So what we're looking at is their expectations and what they believe the project should deliver, and what their concerns are, and what may disrupt or cost the project, its failure to achieve. So what we're trying to get here is early insight to help us further validate the business case, to bring risk and constraints to the surface, to ensure that the project's objectives are realistic before we start doing any planning. And so that in this case, at this point, perceptions matter. So a stakeholder's concerns can influence the outcome, even if they don't have a formal authority at this point to do that. So the goal is not to resolve everything during initiation, but it's to make these concerns visible and make sure they're acknowledged. And doing this early in the projects reduces the resistance because stakeholders are engaged early. It prevents any kind of surprises as their expectations change, and it sets up a foundation for effective feedback, planning, and value delivery. And this slide basically just shows some examples of the stakeholder benefits and concerns. It's not meant to be a exhaustive list at all. It's just some high-level things that we need to think about. Initiation establishes an engagement baseline. It determines how our engagement with the stakeholders evolve. And this is a stakeholder engagement assessment matrix. And this is from the PMBOK 8. And it helps us understand where stakeholders currently are. And they're either unaware, we've identified these things and maybe they don't even aware they're a stakeholder yet. Maybe they're resistant, maybe they're neutral, maybe they're supportive, or maybe they're actually one of the leaders. And we may need them to, this kind of gives us an idea where they are and where we might need them to be moving forward successfully. So maybe we've got a stakeholder out there that's in this unaware they're not aware they're a stakeholder. We need to reach out to them and bring them in. Somebody that's neutral, we maybe want to move them to supportive. Somebody that's resistant, we may want to at least move them to neutral. And maybe we could bring a stakeholder into a leading role in the project. Maybe they could become a key asset on the project. So we're really looking at their expectations and what we believe that what they believe the project, based on what they believe the project should deliver. And we want to kind of look at any concerns that they might have. And so again, the perceptions matter. And the goal is not to force this engagement, but to start looking at how to resolve this resistance and how we can create an engagement plan to bring the desirable visibility so that our concerns and expectations, so that their stakeholder concerns and expectations are acknowledged. Again, we're trying to continue to validate the business case, surface resists risk and constraints, and make sure that our objectives are realistic. And so this is all part of that continuum. And it gets us down to the next part of this, which is the stakeholder register. It's what we're really trying to build, and it's really just a visual representation of the different stakeholders. Again, here we would have the actual name here instead of these are duplicate. We list the name, what their role is, what their project success is, what their interests are, what their influence level is using that influence diagram we had, their potential impact, that's that engagement matrix thing, their current engagement level, again, the engagement matrix, where we want them to be, what preferences that they might have, and what are our preferences for engaging them, and what priority is they are in this engagement process. And so like a project sponsor, high priority, the project sponsor approves technically changes and allocates funding so that we would want to give them regular updates. Where maybe somebody low down here, like a regulatory person, we want to keep them informed. And so the key here would be the identification in the register. But this is a pretty typical one. Then we would extend this register to these engagement strategies into their communications plan. So this output becomes a key input to that. So now but what we've done is we've generated awareness. And a lot of projects, some organizations will take this information and bring all the stakeholders that they've identified together and do once the project charter is signed or authorized, they'll do a formal project kickoff where they present all of this to the team and the stakeholders. We've kind of wrapped this up here. We need to understand and remember that project success is largely determined by before planning even begins, through all these processes, through selection. So it's about choosing the right initiatives and in a constrained environment. And then initiation is about converting those choices into authorized and aligned commitments. And that the emphasis here is that value delivery, stakeholder alignment, and governance, they're not just processes. They're things that we need to get straight in the beginning so we have a good foundation so that if we get them wrong, we can still be able to deliver value that we're going. So, even if we get them wrong, we could do really, and we've seen before, we could deliver on all of the technical success. But if we don't have those expectations from stakeholders baked into this, we could still deliver, underachieve our value expectations. And so this slide just basically documents pretty much everything we talked about so far. Any questions on this? Okay, everybody back? So the idea here, and I copied, by the way, the link to this folder in the chat. This is the folder to the breakout room. So breakout room looks like we're going to have 4 of them. So room 1, 2, and 3 and 4, and I'll open the rooms up here in just a minute. But just to kind of give you an example, you go here to this breakout room activity 1, it's got project context, business case, um, all of this information. Got a little bit of a cost breakdown. It's got some of the benefits activity. So the idea here is to create a project charter. Okay. So, but what I thought might be uh, beneficial, the idea is to go use the Infinity AI to do this. And I had a thought that might help speed this up a little bit and still deliver kind of what I'd like to see. Um, so I did this yesterday, and I um, asked it to complete this assignment. I don't see the actual uh, chat that I put in. It just gives me the, yeah, here it is. Have complete this assignment. And I just copy and pasted the whole breakout activity into Infinity. And then it gave me this document, this project charter document. And so I was thinking that we could do the same for all y'all, and then we would go through in a little readout and talk about what these are. So you need to kind of read the project plan, the Word, the Google document that's there to get a familiarity with it. And then we're going to go through each step and you can explain what it came up with. And so this is one of the things that when I was talking about in other classes, other sessions where AI is really going to make it easy for us to, it's going to facilitate really the hybrid project where every project is basically project approach is customized to the context of that project. So I could see out in your job, you have all these artifacts that you've created from the selection process, and you load those into maybe you have an AI that's trained on your organization or your market or whatever. Like this is just trained on generic project management stuff. And you say, hey, build me a project charter and initial stakeholder register for this project. And it just generates it for you. And so that you don't have to one of the big roles of a sort of a center of excellence or a value management office or a PMO, a project management office, is one of the big things they contributed was standardized project documents and artifacts. Well, you don't need standardized stuff anymore. You need customized stuff that helps you be more impactful. And then you could, then your stakeholders will get used to this and they'll leverage the AI themselves. So I'm going to open the breakout rooms. Let me close this right quick. And I figured we'd work on this. I mean, it should only take about, say, 10 minutes for the initial activity. And then um, to do this, so let me move this off of the screen and stop the share. And so it should only take about 10 minutes and then come back and each team has, 3 to 5 minutes, however long it takes to kind of go through and review what the Infinity has generated for you. So are we okay with that? Okay, we should all be back. Breakout room 1, do you guys want to share your screen and show what you got from Infinity?
Alrighty, so this is what we copied and pasted into Infinity. We copied the project context, all of the information that was outlined in the Google Doc that you submitted to us. And then my prompt was to create a project charter, stakeholder register, and then the assumptions of risks and things like that. So this is what I developed. Pretty good outline. There's still a lot of information to fill in, of course, just because some of the information wasn't available, but I'm zooming in here so you can see everything. So we got the project charter, and then so yeah, this is some of the deliverables you asked for, as far as like the stakeholders' roles and responsibilities. Again, we don't have names for these, but if we had names, we'd populate them here. What department? Just gave us a very thorough outline of what we can include in the charter, as well as the other ask for this assignment. I'm gonna just jump down, so I apologize for the quick scrolling. But
All right.
looking at the risks and the assumptions, the constraints and things like that, outlining which ones are the highest levels versus low level and things like that.
Okay. And what does it say about the project management methodology down there?
Hybrid is what it's suggesting here.
Yeah.
So combination of agile and waterfall.
Okay.
Yes,
So you can see how powerful this tool can be. And
absolutely.
you can use this as a guide to kind of further develop it out. 'Cause like you say, it's missing some, it's obviously missing some information because you didn't have it, right?
Mhm.
So what is this project about?
This project is for, I don't want to miss. Um, so this project addresses the growing market demand for short-skilled focused online credentials among working professionals and career changes.
Yeah. So there's that vision statement that I talked about.
Hmm.
Should come over from the business case. So the business case is an input into this. And so good. All right. Let's break out room 2. You want to share and
See me flipping through? Yeah.
now I see it.
Here's the PMI Infinity. If we just copied and paste, or this is about Summit Valley University, and it seemed a lot like Amberton. They're a private, regionally accredited institution trying to grow their online program. And so if you just plug it in, it'll give you a recap, concise summary. So you do have to ask it specifically to complete the assignment, make into a charter. And then once you do that, it'll generate something like this, which here it is. And you can see it's got all of the elements, purpose and objectives first. We've got the high level scope, and then it goes down to stakeholders, project management authority, which is very important there,
Mm-hmm.
timeline and milestones, budgets, assumptions, risks, methodology, the approval, and then the change log. So,
So you can see where what Infinity's doing here, and this is pretty common for, especially for small to medium-sized projects, where the charter, the stakeholder register, the assumptions log, all of that stuff is in one document, right? And so that's one way to see this, and you present all the initiating artifacts in there. And so when you get sign off, you've kind of completed the initiation process. So this is cool. It lists the key deliverables there. Again, we're high level at this point. Um, Shows up there out of scope, in scope. That's great. Shows that on ground course operating and degree programs are out of scope. So that's the boundaries that we talked about. All right, cool. Let's go look at breakout room 3.
Is that coming through? Can you all see that?
Yeah.
So breakout room 3, we had North River University. So basically, in a nutshell, North River University is currently relying on a legacy human resources system that basically supports the payroll, benefits, admin, and employee records. But this system is nearing its end of life. So the vendor support is scheduled to expire within the next 18 months. So essentially, what needs to happen is we need to do a migration from this older legacy HR system to a newer, modern cloud-based human resource system. So it's pretty straightforward scope. Like I mentioned, just replace this legacy system before we lose any payroll or benefits, admin, employee records information. So justification, like I mentioned, it's no longer supported by our vendors. It will reach its end of life within the next 18 months. In terms of the deliverables, let's see, let me scroll down. Um, project charter, I think is a little bit further up. Um,
Yeah, there it is.
yeah, establishing project direction. Stakeholder register is a little bit further down. Sorry if you were reading through this. Um, basically, pans out everybody's responsibility, project sponsor being the one to provide authorization, securing the resources, and ensures alignment with the business objectives, all the way down to the system vendor, newer vendor that provides system implementation, all being authorized by the project sponsor, providing overall project direction. In terms of the assumption log, we derived assumption log basically from these list of assumptions here. Leadership will prioritize the project due to system end of life. Any sort of constraints or highlighting at least one high risk constraint. We could run into data migration complexity coming from this older HR legacy system to a cloud-based system. Also could, have resistance from the users from systems changes. Um, I think for the most part, that should hit the deliverables.
Okay, good. And what does it say for the methodology? Hybrid again. It all,
Yeah,
yeah. Okay.
yeah. So hybrid being combining some iterative softwares, some agile components using iterative software rollouts, but sticking to more of a predictive approach for the overall governance and external management, external
Yeah.
vendor management.
Yeah. So it's suggesting that you maybe lean a little towards predictive because one, the reasons it would do that is because you have 18 months. You have like a hard
Right,
deadline,
right,
right?
right.
Yeah. So you want to be able to be more predictive there, but also utilize, especially like address some of these risks, the data migration complexity. I've done a lot of these kind of projects, mapping the old data to the new data,
Mhm.
to the new database system is always a problem, and that's probably best done through an iterative process, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
So cool. Um, this is great. All right. Thanks.
yeah.
So we are done for this class today. I'll see you guys next week. And those of you that are in the 2.21 class, I'll see you in Frisco. The rest of you, I'll see you on Zoom. So y'all go and have a good and safe week. And if you have any questions, you have any concerns, don't hesitate to reach out. All righty.
Okay, see you later.
Copy that.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Good
you.
night. Have a good day.
Enjoy your weekend.
You too. Thanks.
Yeah, have a good weekend.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you, Dr. Darnell.
You're welcome.